welcome to Studying Law Around the World. I'm Claudio Klaus. In each episode, I talk with lawyers, law students, and professors from different parts of the world to talk about legal education, careers, and what the profession looks like in real life. We talk about the hard parts, the surprises, and the decisions that shaped their paths. Whether you're planning to study abroad, thinking about working in another legal system, or just curious about how law works around the world, this podcast is for you. Today, I have the opportunity to interview Hana Dhanji. She's the founder and CEO of Cognitrex Inc., an enterprise learning infrastructure company focused on building structured, role-based workforce readiness systems for complex organizations. She began her career in international law and diplomacy, training and practicing at leading global law firms, including Sullivan and Cromwell and Hogan Lovells, across New York, London, and Dubai. Working with all these elite institutions have shaped her understanding of how performance is engineered through systems, not talent alone. Thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudio. I appreciate it.
And to start off our podcast, I'd love for you to tell us a little more about your story, especially on the point that you trained and practiced at firms across New York, London, Dubai. I wanted to ask you, what did these environments teach you about performance, pressure?
Yeah, it's a great question. Working in New York, London, and Dubai taught me a lot about elite environments. And it was really clear that they don't run alone on talent. Structure matters so critically to performance. Everyone is intelligent, everyone is ambitious. The differentiator really isn't IQ. It's whether the system around an individual reinforces judgment, prioritization, and accountability. So in high pressure environments, you can see very quickly when expectations are clear, feedback loops are tight, and standards are non-negotiable. When that happens, performance rises because expectations are clear. But when those elements are inconsistent, even really brilliant people will struggle to perform. And that observation stayed with me, and it shifted how I think about professional growth, not as a matter of motivation, but as a matter of system design.
That's so interesting. It makes me think a lot about the different opportunities that I have work-wise so far. I had the opportunity to start my career in a land registry office where systems were in place, where I had a very senior, not only in age, but really in deep work experience and expertise boss. And it really shaped many things up until today of how I work or the things I do. And I think that plays such a big role. I really love you mentioning that. And going forward, in these elite institutions, as you said, there's a lot of talent. But I'm curious, specifically in the legal field, in your experience, what separates those lawyers who build, durable, compounding careers from those who plateau and burn out?
Yeah, lawyers who sustain performance over decades really understand this concept you referred to called compounding. They don't just complete tasks, they build judgment, they build expertise, and they build credibility over time. And they do this by refining decision-making. They seek environments specifically where feedback is structured and not random. It's through that iterative process that they develop what works, what doesn't, and they refine their approach to specific dynamics. Plateauing, on the other hand, often happens when learning becomes only episodic. So mistakes get replicated without feedback, without corrections. And then when you get training, only then do you realize perhaps you were doing something wrong. But by that point, the muscle around the incorrect procedures or the errors has already been reinforced. Now, durable careers are really built when learning is embedded into the workflow on a consistent basis, when every deal, every dispute, every client interaction becomes part of structured development. And that insight really became central to how I think about organizations more broadly. Training has to accompany the lived daily experience. It cannot be something that feels separate from the work that you accomplish. And if you can embed training in the day-to-day work, you actually improve exponentially the performance of otherwise very hardworking, smart lawyers. That behavior changes more quickly and sustainably.
Amazing. I really appreciate you sharing those. And I want to dive a little bit more and learn a little more about you. So I saw here that you later moved into executive coaching, and we've spoke about this in the podcast before. So I wanted to ask you a little more, how did you or what did you begin to notice about leadership, performance, that those traditional legal training environments did not really teach it explicitly, especially?
Yeah, so in executive coaching, I got this really rare opportunity to get firsthand insight into what really high performers in the legal profession struggle with. and high performers in general struggle with in corporate environments. And what I found really surprised me, high performers, as we know, rarely lack intelligence and they rarely lack drive. What they lack more often than not when they're hitting roadblocks is structural reinforcement. So in law firms especially, development is often assumed to happen through exposure. You just get enough reps in on the deal, sit in on enough client meetings and you'll figure it out. You work on sophisticated matters, you watch partners, you absorb through osmosis. And that can work, but only up to a point, as I'm sure you've seen in your own work and with other lawyers you've spoken to. Exposure itself in this way is very inconsistent. Feedback is uneven. Expectations are implicit rather than articulated, and learning seems to become dependent on which partner you happen to work with. In other words, your growth and your professional development over time is left to chance rather than systematically reinforced. And that creates variability over time and often in ways that are quite biased. So I began noticing over time through my coaching practice that firms and enterprises rely heavily on individual excellence, whether that's partner brilliance or senior leadership instinct, but they often underinvest in the architecture that makes excellence reproducible at every level across all different types of employees or learners. And this insight in particular is what informed Cognitrex. How do we create standardized, recurring, reproducible forms of excellence across the board at each level of seniority within enterprises or law firms?
That's quite interesting. Was there a moment when you realized that advising individuals wasn't enough, considering that you just mentioned this structure really makes such a big difference? And speaking of that, how did that make you want to build something larger?
Yeah, I mean, I love working with my clients. I really enjoyed the one-to-one aspect. I think there's something incredibly compelling from a rapport building perspective and deeply satisfying, but it's not scalable. The kind of changes I wanted to make, you can refine the individual as much as possible. You can give them tools, build confidence, build skill sets, but they're always going to be operating within structures. And if those structures don't change, there's only so much an individual's own efforts can produce. So at some point, I realized that advising individuals inside fragile systems has limits. You can coach someone to be resilient, you can sharpen their judgment, but if the organization itself lacks structured capability development, then the friction will continue. So I became more interested over time in designing environments rather than advising simply within them. And so Cognitrex was born from that shift, moving from individual performance optimization to institutional capability architecture. And we're still exploring, since we're early stages, we're still very much exploring what that looks like in law firms in particular.
Amazing. Sounds very, very exciting. I think that some of the articles I've read before, they have some of the things that you say that describe learning as an infrastructure rather than content. I really appreciated something that you wrote about like micro learning and how that plays a role, but it's not always the best way for learning everything. And thinking about the context of law firms or legal departments, what does that distinction mean to you or in this context that you found yourself working?
Yeah, learning as infrastructure, that's such an important term. And in many organizations, you're absolutely right. Learning is treated as programming. So that looks like courses, workshops, compliance modules, some of which might be micro-learning in nature, others may be long 2-hour video presentations you sit down and watch in one go. But infrastructure is different from programming. Infrastructure means capability is sequenced. So you build on skill 1, and then you add skill 2, skill 3. So it becomes a sort of compounding series of skills that increase your performance capacity. Infrastructure also means that reinforcement is deliberate. You don't get exposure once and then you're done. You get reinforcement over time so that more of the information really starts to sink in and gets applied to your daily exposure. Knowledge is also something that in infrastructure will survive turnover. We often see, especially in law firms, that there's one person who knows how to do all the deals or has had a lot of exposure to a certain client. They leave and suddenly the group is panicked. Knowledge is about creating the infrastructure that allows those individual interactions and the knowledge that individual people carry to remain in the system and be part of the overall learning. Infrastructure means that standards are visible, progression is structured, and that there's predictable pathways to your progression. For a law firm in particular, that might mean moving beyond continuous legal education, so CLE credits as a compliance requirement, and moving towards structured progression tied to role, complexity, and judgment maturity. So instead of thinking about learning as a checkbox exercise, how many hours of equity, diversity, and inclusion programming did you watch? And how many hours of, skill development did you watch? How much is what you are learning improving your judgment in certain situations? This is why we have things like AI role play, or we present to our clients when we're creating structured modules the most difficult scenarios. Do you understand what steps to take in trying to solve that problem? So we're looking at learning as application, not learning as completion. And that's the big difference. When learning becomes infrastructure in a successful way, performance becomes predictable. That's the measurement. Can you put any associate into that position and get the same predictable outcome? Because when variability is high, it means that there's no underlying infrastructure.
Very, very interesting. It sounds like a lot more people maybe could succeed in this profession if we just had that structure and infrastructure in place in most workplaces. I often talk about how this is a profession where there's a high amount of people who just choose to leave it entirely, different than, for example, doctors in the medical field. And it's been interesting to observe some trends. But listening to this, it resonates in so many ways. For lawyers who feel their growth is becoming fragmented, what structural adjustments, not just personal habits, should they consider?
Yeah, I think this is an important responsibility that every lawyer needs to take. It's one thing to be evaluated in structured performance reviews. It's another thing to really sit down and think about what skills you want to develop at each year of call, so at each stage in your progression as a junior associate, mid-level, senior, and to audit your own development. And the question that you need to ask at each stage is, are you accumulating years of experience, or are you actually becoming more sophisticated in your performance? Are you repeating at the same level, or are you getting the skills needed to take on increasing levels of responsibility? And we call this compounding capability. The second thing they should ask, or you should ask, is, am I in the right environment? And the type of environment you want to look for is one that provides structured feedback and defined progression expectations. In other words, are you performing at the level of a first year at the top 10%? Are you at the middle, or are you at the bottom? And if you can't calibrate where you are in your performance capacity, if you don't understand whether you've mastered the first year level skills, it's hard to go into your successive stages of career progression and feel confident. Am I a successful fourth year? Am I a competent sixth year? At year 8, is it fair for me to raise my hand and ask to be a partner? Have I mastered those skills? So you always want to audit compounding capabilities along the way. And the third thing that one should think about long term is whether the institution creates opportunities for that infrastructure that we talk about. Is there institutional fragility, or is there actual structural support for your long-term success at the firm? Because some lawyers can successfully build careers within institutions, but others are going to have to build the institutions themselves in order to succeed. And you've got to decide, am I in an environment that's fragile, or do I need to create an environment that can actually support where I'm going? And if you get that wrong, you'll invest years in certain places that never reward your extra effort, never recognize the work you're taking on, don't necessarily give you the exposure you need. And suddenly you find that you've ended up mediocre in a profession where you really could have excelled if the right support had been there.
Amazing. A very important institutional point where institutions can take the necessary measures, but then also in another point where you as a professional take responsibility over your career and see what has to be done in regards to your development. Thinking about, you just founded Cognitrex to address those structural gaps in how organizations are building capacity. I'm curious to know, what problem are you most focused on solving right now?
Cognitrex is interesting because we currently have a learning OS platform that allows us to bring in interactive learning to make it more engaging, to ensure that when training is offered, it's through reinforcement, it's something that can be applied directly to work right away. But mostly from a high-level perspective, Cognitrex is really focused on helping regulated and complex organizations like law firms modernize in general how they build capability. And in the first instance, you need a strong set of learning modules and courses, but how you apply them is equally important. So we know that many enterprises and platforms, they have content, they have compliance reporting, but what they lack is cohesion. Structured pathways, in other words, that connect learning to role expectations and performance outcomes. So how does this learning get leveraged, in other words? We help design learning environments that make development deliberate rather than accidental. So if you're a first-year associate, what onboarding needs to happen? If you're a second-year associate, what progressive skill development do you need and how do you measure it? What kinds of increasing levels of complexity should you be taking on, and how is that complexity monitored? Is how do we evaluate mastery, in other words, to give you progressively more challenging work? So this includes content modernization from our perspective. We help modernize content so that it is more engaging, accessible, and reinforceable. We work on structured sequencing, part A, part B, part C in year 1, and then in year 2, A, B, C. And we work as well on interactive scenario-based learning, which is the best way to learn. It's through real-world scenarios. Over time, we plan to focus a lot more as well on readiness. So how organizations assess and govern capability in high consequence environments. So right now, a lot of learning is just simply focused on completion rates. Did you sit through the training, yes or no? And then the only real evaluation is, did you take the quiz at the end? And usually the questions are things you could have answered without watching the video. Readiness is a measurement that's completely different. Readiness is about whether or not the course you did watch has translated into meaningful behavioral change. So readiness can only be evaluated through assessments that look at knowledge completion, but also performance feedbacks. Also, how much exposure have you had to certain deals? Have you demonstrated strong judgment when faced with particular situations? Readiness is the translation of knowledge into action, and that's what we're focused on, not just creating good content, but did the content create impact in how people perform? And I'll tell you why this matters so much, Claudia. There are certain professions in which performance actually affects people's lives in very meaningful ways. So if you have an underperforming salesperson, for example, it may not be a make or break impact on somebody else. But if you have a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer who's not able to perform at full capacity, that leads to patient injuries, that leads to liability, that can lead to exposure for companies. If you're looking at workplace safety for people who aren't able to translate workplace safety training into real practice, that can lead to injuries or explosions or damage to equipment. So we focus on regulated industries where training isn't just a tick box exercise. It's something that can truly impact people's lives. And we focus a lot right now on Canadian companies, especially because we believe Canadian workers deserve to be looked after by their employers. We know that Canadian companies deserve to have best in class training wherever possible. And we love partnering with Canadian companies because it also means we can apply for grants to invest in the development of new learning technologies for our communities. So it's really exciting to be at the forefront of learning and development and to see that shape the communities in which we operate here in Canada.
Very exciting. So if you were advising a high-performing associate who senses that maybe they want to build something of their own at some point, or maybe even, just have the most possibility of freedom and, have as many doors open as possible, what should they start developing now, in your opinion?
Yeah, I highly encourage entrepreneurship. I think it's incredibly exciting. I think a lot of people see it as a risk, but you can take a calculated risk. So my first piece of advice is it's about sequencing. Make sure that you've mastered the skills that the legal context offers you. Take advantage of those initial years in law where you really build a foundation for critical thinking, judgment, and decision making. And don't feel pressure to leave prematurely. It's a really important skill building time. And if you're somebody who's mid-career or you're even a partner and thinking of starting on your own, I would say go for it. There's really no perfect time to start a business. As long as you know that you've mastered a core set of skills that will serve you, you've built a sufficient network to be able to build your business by leveraging. And as long as you understand that entrepreneurship is not a form of rebellion against the system, it's a form of architecture. And the best entrepreneurs I know are the ones who do boring, tedious work over and over and over again very well. Boring consistency is what makes or breaks a company. It's not as fast-paced as it looks in the movies. It's not as exciting all the time, but the gains are real. The scalability is astronomical. You really have uncapped potential to earn and to grow and to build, but there has to be method to the madness. So master that discipline, master that structure, master that judgment, build your networks. And only at that point would I say leave, because this is a profession that gives you so much and it can be used as a springboard into entrepreneurship rather than a rebellion or an alternative to it that doesn't connect. They definitely connect. And I think I'm a better entrepreneur because I studied as a lawyer first.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share more about Cognitrex, about your career, and these awesome insights. I appreciate you being here in the podcast.
Thank you so much, Claudio. Thanks again.
Thank you all for tuning in.